Welcome to Blue Talks.
Welcome to academia. We own you. Those were the first words I heard when I entered graduate school. I politely had to raise my hand and tell my professor, ma'am, with all due respect, I did not come here for sale. Angeline, if you're going to be in academia, then you need to learn the rules of this journey. My response to this racialized as Asian man, I said, sir, I have no issues with learning your rules. The only problem is no one gave me a handbook. I have no clue of what the rules are. Angeline, you know, sometimes it's just your tone. So I went to visit that professor for a check-in about a week later. And I said, Professor, you know, it's funny, you gave us this assessment, and the assessment said that both you and I were assertive. May I ask why all of a sudden, when I stood on my principles, I became aggressive? And he looked at me, and he just lowered his head. And he said, I must apologize to you. I had no idea I even called you aggressive. So I need to look at me and ask myself, why did I label you in that stereotype? Angeline, I see why your work doesn't fit. I see why you don't fit. So that led me to begin to look up and research what exactly does fit mean in academia. And I found that fit meant one who will go along to get along, one who will assimilate to a culture and acculturate, one who will remain status quo when necessary, and one who will refuse to rock the boat. And so when I met back with that professor, I said, well, according to your standards, I don't fit. However, according to my standards, I didn't come in here as a misfit. So one of us, ... Now, can you please help me make it to the other side, or do I need to find someone else for my committee? That was another story, what happened at the end of all of that. But the best one, and that was a racialized as Black man who said that to me. The first was a racialized as a biracial professor. And then the next one, a racialized as white woman, self-identified lesbian, said, you know what, Angeline? You and your cohort, you have the wrong idea about why we brought you here. I said, wow, that's very interesting. And as one who has served in government and looked at politics, what I really hear you saying is a form of coded language, because my cohort was predominantly all Black women, with the exception of one white woman, all of us racialized. And I said, that's not true, ma'am, what you just said to me. I was chosen, and you asked me to come here because of my background in activism and my background in organizing. So my question is, what do you do when the inside, you know how to dismantle the outside, but what do you do when it's the inside that is oppressing you? The whole room went silent. So the whole room went silent. And during my course of this journey, I found that I was wearing at least 10 to 12 different masks along with my colleagues just for survival. A term that we call code switching, constant code switching. A term that does not denote freedom. A term that will drive you crazy as several students wrote papers called, Am I Just Going Crazy? And so it began my journey of healing from the trauma of my grad school experience. And I began to think about leadership, and I began to write about plantation politics, and I began to talk about what I was seeing was not true leadership, but I was looking at ship leaders. And so I began to think about racism from the aspect of not just nationally, but a global perspective. And I had to question, could racism exist as a leadership ideology? Why? Because they weren't just vessels that came here. They, in fact, were systems. So when we began to think about ships, and for me, when writing my dissertation, I began to think about enslavement as a whole. And so I began to recognize that most oftentimes when we think about ships, we're thinking about movement. I submit to you that the ships on this journey were not just ships. They were transporting bodies of floating institutions, designed and set up systematically and systemically. If you look at these ships, they existed with extreme precision. They were space optimized for survival and never dignity. And so I ask you, do you believe that in 2025, that ship leaders still can exist? Why? Because we have not quite moved from the hull of the ships to dismantle what has already entered into our hearts, what has already entered into our minds, what is already coded in our DNA. And so how do we get rid of all of this? Because I intentionally stated racialized as this or racialized as that to tell you that this is a humanity problem. Why? Because this exists as not Black history, this exists as American history, and that American history extends globally. Okay, so when we read this quote, we're reading it from one of the overseer's manuals. And so in a minute, I'm going to go over some other quotes from the overseer's manuals. And what I began to recognize and read in my research was this was still in existence today, and that these manuals have become leadership training. These manuals have become, in most oftentimes, whether intentionally or unintentionally, have also become what we call best practices. Whenever I step into a room or I'm invited into somewhere and they say, you know what, Angeline, we're doing this because this is best practices. My question is always, best practices for who? And so what is a ship leader? I'm glad you asked, right? And so a ship leader is one that is definitely obsessed with control, threatened of being questioned. I cannot tell you what we went through in grad school, just asking questions. A ship leader is one that leads with urgency, not understanding, creates dependency instead of development, and demands obedience and not collaboration. That's a ship leader. A ship leader feeds the systems, and let's be very clear, these systems are not broken. I get so tired of going places and people tell me, girl, you know, the systems are broken. No, they're not broken. They're working intentionally, directionally, and prejudicially as they were designed and set up to work from the very beginning. Most often, these systems, when you break them down and begin to analyze them, they are also bleeding the same people who, in many instances, we say that we are here to help. When I do my community activism, it's crazy what I see going on in government. And it's never really, truly, unfortunately, about the people. in these marginalized spaces. It's about those that are sitting in government lining their pockets. And unfortunately, what also begins to happen is all of that becomes another functioning of breeding. Systemic interconnectionality, some of what I addressed in my dissertation, from the aspect of not just silos, but how do all these systems connect? What are we seeing in all of these systems? Like, for example, when we also talk about the education system being the nexus to the prison system, we look at our scores, we look at who's not going to graduate at 3rd grade. We look at how many prisons are we going to have to build from these things. And so when I look at this, which I created as my logo, I began to see that the ships weren't just about the people, they were about an ideology. Modern echoes of plantation leadership. I began to, again, do some research in plantation in the manuals, and I began to look at home, church, and school, and some of the things that we talk about, and the phrases that we use, and how we raise our children, and how we govern our houses. And I looked at, for example, home. And so back in the day, in those manuals, the manual said the enslaved must not be given choices lest they forget their place. Again, in grad school, they sought to remind us of our place. Modern day echoes, you may hear, you don't ever have a say in this household. As long as you're in my home or under my roof, you're gonna follow my rules. Liberation and legacy says that that thought process is a process that teaches fear-based compliance. It replaces voice with a sense of control. And I'm here to tell you that maybe you might have heard it as a child, but this also shows up in intimate partner relationships. Schools, the enslaved must not in question instruction. Order must be maintained at all costs. Today, we hear the class is not a democracy. I am not here to be questioned. Unfortunately, we still do have teachers that think that that's the right mindset. And so that is not a liberating, nor is it a legacy mindset. It is a mindset that suppresses critical thinking and equates authority with silence. And one of my favorites as a PK ×2, pastor's kid, in case you don't know what that is I also began to look at the church at a very, very young age. I ran so far away from God that I ran into him. And so I began to then look at and break down some of the things that we were even taught about from a plantation era about God and about the church and all of these different things. And I was just like, I have been so westernized. And so in some churches, it teaches that emotions are dangerous among the enslaved. Discipline and restraint must be enforced to maintain order. Today, leave your emotions at the door. Just press your way through. You have this. Although I'm sure they mean well by that, as a liberator and a liberation insight, we bring our full selves to God, our praise, our pain, and our processes. And so when we think and when we speak in terms of this does not include our emotional truths. And so in a world that sometimes erases us in the natural, this erases us in the spiritual. And so most oftentimes when we hear stuff like that, the saddest part is we call this professional. So just real quick, if we look at some traits like power, communication, motivation, vision, leadership, ship leaders seek to maintain hierarchy. They usually go from a top-down command. They're fear-based, output-focused, and they generally are always transactional. You don't really get reciprocity. Legacy and liberation leaders share leadership to foster agency. They listen and they co-create together. They're always about the purpose and therefore are purpose-driven. They're legacy-focused, and the main thing about liberation leaders they are transformational. They're all about healing. So I ask, what part of leadership did you inherit from the systems of control? See, we all have inherited our hair texture, and we have inherited our eye color, and for some, we have inherited our true last names. Others, we have not. But what part have you inherited? Have you ever thought about that? But the good news is that we can break some inheritances to make some new ones, right? To create and to shape some new thoughts. And so this is just one of the quotes that I found that I loved in order to do that. And in order to transform and shape and birth free indeed spaces and not those spaces of harm. Which is why I built this program called Leads, right? Because we need some new leadership, we need some new leading going on. We need to be leading from the ground up and not from the top down. And in order to do that, the L stands for legacy. It stands for liberation. It means it's time for us to look, to listen, to learn, but not just to learn, to unlearn, to relearn. E is for, it's for our need to begin to evaluate. Why do you think the way you think? Who told you that was right? Where did that thought come from? And then as you do that, you begin to assess what you're thinking, why you're thinking, how you're thinking. And then if something's not right, it gives you that opportunity to disrupt that thought, dismantle that thought, and design and or redesign a new thought. And all of this how it happens through S, self-reflection, self-introspection, all of it. As you saw, my logo had all of the systems on it, but most oftentimes we don't talk about the system called self. We don't even recognize the system called self. We don't even have an understanding that we too are systems operating in systems that have already hurt us and damaged us before, as we entered through our mother's womb. We already had a blueprint on us. But what does your blueprint say? Does it need to be changed? And if so, and if you're ready to move from sailing in the water to walking on the water, then join me in Leads. Again, University of Cambridge, I say thank you. BLU, I say thank you for extending and affording me this space and grace to enter upon your stage and to talk about a topic that is so weighty, is so timely. Unfortunately, it's still timely, but it's time also to transform the world. I am Dr. Angeline Dean. Thank you very much for your time.